Before I get to the predator part of this research, and for those who are unfamiliar, it's important that we know what is at the front of the BBC building. Absolutely vital and important that we do. It is this. It is the Prospero and Ariel statue. It's been on display at the BBC since 1933. And for those who are unfamiliar, it's despite the attacks that it has endured, despite protests, despite petitions and pleas to the various BBC director generals, they have made it clear, excuse me, that no matter what, this statue will remain in place. This statue was created by the man in the image. His name is Eric Gill. And Eric Gill, after his death in 1940, his diaries revealed that he had abused his daughters, his sisters, and the family dog. And the BBC has been, subject to so many people coming out against this statue because it's a horrific statue. And by the way, what he did, just to show how perverse this man was that he elongated this. So the image of Arion Prospero is associated with broadcasting. So on that, you say, oh, yeah, okay, I can see why it's on the front of Broadcasting House. But there's more to it than that. Obviously, this was a deeply disturbed, abusive predator. And so John Leith, as I say, commissioned him to do this. And it was so perverse that he elongated the penis on the child from the original illustrations. And we often talk about Eric Gill, and not least because his font is still in circulation, right? Gill Sans. I never use it. I don't think it should be available at all, but it is still in circulation. But anyway, this statue has been subject to so much controversy, but they restored it after attack. So it was attacked twice. And the BBC said that the estimated cost of the restoration and work after attack was £529,715. And it's so mealy-mouthed because the BBC say it's understood that the cost has been covered by the BBC rather than claimed on insurance. Well, I have a very good source who claims it was actually Westminster Council who fronted up the cost of restoration for this. And the man who attacked it twice, David Chick of Northamptonshire, pleaded not guilty to causing more than 150,000 worth of damage in May 2023. He was already under investigation for criminal damage to the same statue during a previous incident in 2022. And in March of this year, the judge released David on conditional bail and ordered him not to go within 100 meters of the statue. And a trial for David Chick has been set for May 2026 at Southwark Crown Court. I absolutely intend to be there. And so Gill's statue and the extreme protection of it acts as a metaphor for how the BBC has protected its in-house nonces. That is the reality. The BBC is the home of wrong-uns and is a supporter of wrong-uns from the start. And let me see if I can bring in some of these images as well. Like when you look at the Beeb magazine as one example, right? Beeb magazine for children, very popular magazine. And you had people like, now look, you can't blame people for what happened in hindsight. I'm sorry, I still need to, I'm just going to go off camera slightly so I can just clean my nose properly. Excuse me. There we go. Sorry, this is live. You know how it goes. Right. So obviously we can't blame the BBC per se for putting Gary Glitter, who was later revealed to be an extensive predator. But Gary Glitter was somebody that the BBC supported and says so much about what was wrong with the BBC. This had a number of convictions at the BBC, by the way, including Stuart Hall, including Huw Edwards. But this is just one example of their support for predators. And Jimmy Savile. Where would we be without mentioning Jimmy Savile, for goodness sake? Sir James Wilson Vincent Savile, English media personality, DJ, best known for hosting BBC shows such as Top of the Pops and Jim Will Fix It. After his death, hundreds of allegations of sexual abuse surfaced, and led to a conclusion that he was a predatory sex offender and possibly one of Britain's most prolific. They avoided the fact that he was a very treasured member of the British establishment with a deep friendship to the current king. I mean, just as an aside, by the way, if everybody's kicking off about Andrew, what about Charles? Charles has spent a lifetime surrounded by predators, as I've done in a deep dive. But yeah, Jimmy Savile, the official story is that he was an extensive predator that was allowed to operate with impunity. But they don't talk about his establishment links, how he was a close friend to Margaret Thatcher, the then British Prime Minister, or King Charles, or indeed almost all the royal family. They don't talk about that. But he was able to operate with impunity from the BBC. He abused people at the BBC. There were at least 5 managers who were aware of what he had done. And we then heard that that Jimmy Savile had also abused within the NHS and schools, or a number of places. And the thing is that the BBC did everything they could to cover up what Jimmy Savile had done. So in 2011, the BBC's Newsnight programme very controversially decided to drop a report exposing Jimmy Savile as a serial sexual abuser. And the decision was found to be flawed, was certainly flawed. An independent inquiry took place to look into it, though the independent inquiry, hardy-ha, cleared the BBC of allegations of a high-level cover-up. Of course it would. But let me tell you a little bit about it, because I think it's interesting. So in late 2011, following Savile's death, the Newsnight team began investigating persistent rumours of Savile's sexual misconduct. And reporters Liz McKean and Marion Jones uncovered credible and compelling evidence. Marion Jones, I think it was his auntie, who had a school for troubled girls, where Savile would go and then take girls out in his car for drives. And so Marion Jones had first-hand knowledge of some of Jimmy Savile's exploits. And with Liz McKean at the BBC, they, kind of put together this work, and they intended to air the story before Christmas, but the report was dropped in early December by the programme's editor, Peter Rippon. And what happened in place of this was the BBC then ran a series of tribute shows to Savile to air over the Christmas holidays, right? As I say, quote unquote, an independent report later revealed that McKean and Jones' evidence included allegations of abuse on BBC premises and from women who had not previously spoken to the police. After the BBC's decision became public, the editor, Peter Rippon, published a blog claiming the story was dropped for editorial reasons such as insufficient evidence and the fact that an earlier police investigation had not led to charges. And Rippon's blog post was found to contain a number of factual inaccuracies and incomplete information. Reporters McKean and Jones publicly disagreed with Rippon's editorial decision, with Marion Jones warning Rippon via email that the BBC would be accused of a cover-up. Quite rightly, it was a cover-up, 100%. And this conflict led to allegations of internal suppression of the story. They did internally suppress it because Jimmy Savile was not only enabled by the BBC, but made a ton of money for them. They don't want to lose that ton of money. There was a Pollard report, which was released in December 2012, that concluded the decision to drop the report was flawed, but was made in good faith. And it found no evidence, as I say, of a high-level conspiracy or cover-up. What bunkum. And interestingly, for many people, 5 years later, Liz McKean was said to have died from a stroke. Many people still question that. She was reported to have died on August the 18th, 2017. So we've never got to hear fully, kind of like with the passage of time, some of her thoughts on BBC operations and its approach to its predators. And I would very much have liked to have heard that, because she was somebody who had insider knowledge and was prepared to whistleblow on it. But I also could see how the BBC was shaping and changing what was happening in terms of establishment paedophiles. And the way that they did it was with this fella. Let me just show you. Very curious stuff that took place. And I'm sure you all remember all this. But as a consequence of what happened with Sir Cliff Richard, the BBC changed reporting of, as I say, establishment and famous allegations. So what happened? Cliff Richard was for many years a BBC asset. He had his own BBC TV variety show. It's Cliff Richard. It ran for 4 years from 1970. He was also featured in numerous BBC specials and series like Sir Cliff Richard at the BBC, Songs of Praise and Good Morning Sunday, alongside appearances on shows like Desert Island Discs. He was an absolute, BBC asset, for want of a better description. But what happened, and it was very interesting, was that Cliff Richard ended up very successfully suing the BBC for invasion of privacy after they filmed and reported on a police raid on his home in 2014. It was part of an investigation into sexual assault allegations against him. He was never arrested or charged. And in 2018, a High Court judge ruled that the BBC infringed his privacy rights, awarding him damages and ordering the BBC and South Yorkshire Police to pay significant large costs, with a final settlement of around £2 million paid by the BBC in 2019. And the case led to new legal precedents for suspects and their privacy, and led Cliff Richard to campaign for laws for those accused of sexual offences. But it did so much more than that. It sent a warning shot to other broadcasters that you are going too far in looking at allegations of establishment abuse. And it was extraordinary what they did. So Cliff Richard wasn't even at home. He was in his apartment abroad. I think it might have been Spain or somewhere thereabouts, but he wasn't at home. And this was in Sunningdale in Berkshire. And the police did a live raid on BBC TV. There's no other way to describe it, right? They had helicopters filming, and I have never seen anything like that. And when I saw it, I was like, this is a setup. This is a setup. Now, bear in mind, as I say, Sir Cliff Richard, longtime BBC asset. And Cliff Richard has been subject to many allegations over the years, many allegations over the years, none of them proven, and he's never been charged. But I remember having a conversation. I was a consulting and contributing editor at ITN for 8 years, and a lot of my work involved looking at establishment abuse. And I remember having a conversation with an editor about this bust. Sorry, I'm so sorry about this. I remember having a conversation with an editor about this bust of Cliff Richard, and her saying that changes it all. That changes it all. It was a warning shot to broadcasters to back the F off. That's what it was. And it did. Laws were changed. I mean, it changed broadcasting. People didn't want to look anymore at whether politicians had been involved in high-level cover-up of abuse, because Cliff Richard had for many years been linked with politicians and allegations of abuse. Again, as I say, nothing proven, no convictions. But when they did that live bust on his home, I knew that that was a setup. And very successfully so, because everything changed after that. And within no time at all, you could not get a commissioning editor to agree to cover really anything in terms of establishment abuse. So job well done, frankly, job well done. And of course, where would we be without mentioning him again? The man who announced the death of the Queen and who narrated the King's coronation was found himself to be a filthy predator. He was establishment media with bells on. You do not get chosen to announce the Queen's death or to narrate the coronation unless you are establishment hack through and through. In July 2024, Edwards pleaded guilty to making 41 indecent images of children. He admitted to keeping 7 category A images of the very worst kind on his phone. You can't get worse than category A. He had been sent them on WhatsApp by a pedo, and they were of children between the ages of 7 and 14. It's extraordinary. He had a very glittering 4-decade-long career at the BBC, but the signs were all there. New people who started at the BBC in the newsroom were told to laugh at his jokes and not to question him. It was important that he felt like he was the most intelligent, most well-informed person in the news team, and people were told not to challenge him. Anyway, he was also outed. This wasn't the court case, but he was outed for giving tens of thousands of pounds to a drug addicted teenager in exchange for sexual pictures. And then he was eventually convicted for receiving and having these child abuse images. He was handed a 6-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years, of course, after he admitted having the indecent images. And as I say, these were separate from the allegations of him funding the drug habit of a teenager. And aside from the fact that it's absolutely disgusting, such a predator. I mean, if there's any indication that if somebody is in such a superior position anywhere, that we should question quite why they've got there, Huw Edwards is a perfect example of that. He was seen as the epitome of respectable media, of respectable journalism. And yet in the background, he was nothing but a filthy predator, filthy, disgusting child abuse predator. And you know that we can't legally call him a pedo because he hasn't been done for being a pedo. And one of the reasons why they give suspended sentences to people who have child abuse images is because they're not categorized as pedophiles, which in my opinion actually is outrageous. They create the market, they make it possible for the abuse of these children, and Huw Edwards is no different. But what added to that was the fact that Huw Edwards refused to give back his £200,000 salary that he had received between his arrest and when he resigned from the BBC. And the BBC chairman, Samir Shah, appeared before the Culture, Media and Sport Committee and said that he was refusing to give his money back. I find that extraordinary. How can the BBC not have contractually that if you bring down the name of the corporation in some way, then you will be fined in some way by the corporation? But the idea that he was allowed to keep this £200,000 salary, I think, is absolutely egregious, and still, to my knowledge, has refused to repay it. But there was more about the complicity of the BBC that was taking place, because an hour before he was sentenced on the 16th of September for making those images, BBC Director General Tim Davie received an email which warned that a complaint was made about Huw Edwards as far back as 2012. And of course, guess what? Nothing was done about it. And the email came from a former BBC employee who said he wished to personally and potentially flag an area of risk to the corporation that you may not be previously aware of. They said a complaint had been made against Edwards, adding, "The reason for my email to you is just to flag that there is a high probability that this complaint was documented somewhere, but was, by recollection, to have been deemed non-actionable." And the ex-employee stressed that this was not necessarily a criminal allegation, and I have no real specifics I can offer you other than it exists. Well, that was significant enough and came from a substantial enough source that Tim Davie replied 3 minutes later. Okay, you have to be somebody substantial if he's replying within 3 minutes. And he confirmed that he would share it with the team investigating past allegations. But, you know, the reality is allegations against Huw Edwards were being made at least a decade before the BBC were forced to act. And they even, you know what they did, right? The parents of the teen who was receiving the money for Huw Edwards went to the BBC and complained to the BBC, and they refused to act. So the parents felt they had no choice whatsoever but then to go to tabloid media. And they went to tabloid media, and I don't know if you remember this when it was happening. They went to tabloid media, and it came out that there was a BBC presenter who had been doing this, but no name was released. And then eventually, I thought this was quite interesting. It was actually Huw Edwards' wife who gave up his name as being the person at the center of it. Wife, it's Huw. They're now divorced. I'm sure that's not a shocker to people. Not at all. I couldn't stand Huw Edwards even before this. He was a lockdown pusher, major lockdown narrative. And yet it was also alleged that he had breached lockdown rules several times, including to meet a 23-year-old stranger from a dating site, while the BBC was at the same time telling millions of people to follow the rules as part of its fear-mongering campaign. And, I think it's astonishing that Huw Edwards got to the point where he was able to resign from the BBC. I think that tells you so much about the culture of the BBC. Remember what I said, propaganda and predators. Yes, indeedy, propaganda and predators. And that is the reality. And guess who crops up in this story? Emily Maitlis. She came out. She was blasting BBC reporters for what she deemed distasteful reporting of allegations against Huw Edwards instead of going to HR. And she said that she was surprised that the broadcaster continued to investigate while vulnerable presenter is in hospital, because he was then hospitalized after all of this came out. Before he was convicted and charged, but when it all came out that he was giving money to this teen drug addict, we then heard that he was hospitalized. So Emily Maitlis then came out and saying it was distasteful reporting and everything. Yeah, we got you, Emily. We got you. We got you. Yeah, we have. So Emily Maitlis, long time at the BBC, defending him. But the BBC has all manner of issues and convictions amongst its former staff. Numerous BBC employees and on-air personalities have been convicted of serious crimes, including sexual offences against children and adults, stalking and making indecent images of children. So you have Huw Edwards as one example. Then there's the whole issue of Jimmy Savile, who was never charged because he had the police in his pocket and the establishment. And he used to have his Friday morning club where the police from the local Nick would come around, his handshaky Freemasonry friends. Then there was Rolf Harris, who was convicted in 2014 of 12 counts of indecently assaulting girls. Stuart Hall, convicted in 2013 and 2014 of sexually abusing young girls and women, with crimes spanning several decades. You had Chris Denning, radio DJ, pleaded guilty to 21 child sex offences in 2016 and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. It goes on and on. There was also Jonathan King as one example. I know Jonathan King is really big on pleading his innocence these days. But he was convicted at one stage.